Bore da Pawb, good morning and welcome to the Wen Cafe on women and the right to adequate housing. But we're really delighted to bring you with three of our brilliant member organisations. That's Pawb, Shelter Cymru and BAWSO. And we've got three brilliant panellists. We've got Alicja from Pawb, Ruth Power from Shelter and Samsunear Ali from BAWSO. And I'll be introducing them all shortly when I come to them for questions. But first of all, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Wen Wales and introduce the topic. So my name's Catherine Fookes, I'm the director of Wen Wales, and we're a membership organisation and we're fighting for a Wales free from gender discrimination. And by that, we mean we want men and women to have equal power and equal opportunity to shape their lives and shape society and take part in society. And with that big kind of aim of a Wales free from gender discrimination, we have three strategic priorities. The first one is around growing and mobilising our coalition of activists and members to really help us make that change happen. The second strategic priority is around equal representation and leadership. And under that kind of strand of our work, we do our Diverse 50-50 campaign, which is campaigning for electoral reform, so that we get a diverse and equal Senedd and local government. Also under that strand of our work is our mentoring scheme, which is encouraging more women to get into public life and political life. So that's our second objective, it's the equal representation and leadership. Then our third strategic priority is around strengthening women's rights in Wales and strengthening those rights and then embedding them in law. And so we believe that women's rights are human rights, and we're campaigning for the CEDAW Convention to be, its principles to be put into Welsh law so that women have the protection of the Convention of the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And it's under that objective around the rights of women that we really come to this important discussion today, because the pandemic has of course impacted us all in many, many ways, but those who are most disadvantaged in society have most definitely suffered the most, and housing and women's right to housing is absolutely central to that. So I'm delighted to first of all introduce Alicja, who's the director at Pawb, and previously she worked at Race Equality First, and she's a tireless campaigner for women's rights to housing. And I want to ask you first, Alicja, what do we mean by right to adequate housing, and why is it so important for women?
Thanks very much, Catherine, for this great introduction, and absolutely right to focus on women's rights. It's great to see that as one of your kind of strategic objectives. And right to housing is one of those rights. We started kind of looking at this issue about two years ago. We launched a feasibility report on how a right to adequate housing could be introduced in Wales and what it would mean for the governments, but for people, really. That was our focus. And kind of what prompted us to do that was back then the horrible, terrible tragedy of Grenfell fire. And what also prompted me to look at it is an article I read somewhere from a renowned international human rights expert who said that if we had right to housing in the UK, in this case, this would not have happened. And that sort of kind of stuck with me. And fast forward to March last year, and as you said, kind of once again, we're realizing that a safe, accessible, affordable place to live is hugely important, not only to live in, but it's crucial to be healthy, to stay healthy, crucial to eradicating poverty, and it's essential to human survival, really. And stay at home was one of those kind of most important messages that we've been hearing ever since the pandemic happened. But then that probably makes everyone reflect as well on what happens if you don't have a safe, a good home, or you're homeless. And right to housing is important for women because housing exclusion, homelessness, all those issues, they're gendered issues. It's worth noting that the cost of housing is amongst the top 4 factors that contribute to poverty in the UK and in Wales, and women are generally poorer in our society. And I'm sure that Ruth and Sam will talk about in detail about kind of how how housing is a feminist issue and how housing exclusion really affects women. They are experts in this, and I'm sure many of you here are experts, but housing insecurity in general affects women more, especially lone mothers. What we can see is that more and more families and children, for example, now live in a private rented sector where security of tenure is an issue, no DSS is an issue, and women are much more likely to claim or kind of manage the housing benefit side of things. You know, now and again, I'm sure many of you will have seen it, but now and again I see kind of desperate really posts on some of the various local Facebook groups that I'm part of people looking for a rented house because they've been served an eviction notice and they're desperate to have it in the catchment area for their kids. And so far, all the posts that I have seen are from women. And it kind of shows how home and issues related to housing affect women, not to mention the horrible, abominable, really exploitation through sex for rent. So all of this affects women differently, and in many instances more. Domestic violence, immigration status, asylum seeker housing, if you could call it that, really affects women differently. And right to housing, yeah.
Sorry, quick question just to break in there. Do we know the stats on how many people are homeless in Wales, and the proportion that are women and the proportion that are men? Or is that not even a relevant question?
It probably is a relevant question. I'm probably not the right person to speak about it. I don't know whether any of the other speakers would have the stats. I'm aware that people, for example, who, and Ruth might not know more about it, that people who contact Shelter Cymru for advice, that huge numbers of them are women.
Okay, let's
overrepresented, aren't they, Ruth?
Yeah, funny enough, one of the things I was double checking was my understanding yesterday that the data from Welsh Government doesn't actually split by gender. Yeah, and so as to introduce myself, Ruth Pawb from Shelter Cymru. So we help thousands of people each year in local authorities across Wales who are sort of experiencing the housing emergency, affected by homelessness and affected by the risk of losing their home, rent arrears, disrepair, and the kind of poor conditions in housing that we were highlighting yesterday in when we published some data on the housing emergency in Wales and encouraged people to join our fight for home. 60% of the people that we see are women, 60%, so women are overrepresented in our service users. The Welsh Government data shows 6,000 people currently in temporary accommodation and homeless, but doesn't split that by gender. And also shows, most recent data, 51 people rough sleeping, but again, doesn't split that by gender. But our data for 2020 was quite interesting to me, actually, just to see how that compared with that Welsh Government data. So we saw 141 women who were street homeless during 2020. We saw another 21 on top of that who were sleeping in a car, and another 450 women who were hidden homelessness, staying with friends, staying with relatives, and many of whom will be sort of what people commonly refer to as sofa surfing. So that's an idea of the figures. But I think one of the key issues is that the national data isn't split by gender.
Yes, Ruth, quite. Thank you very much for just putting into context some of those figures there. And I'll come back to you with some further questions shortly, Ruth. I'm now going to introduce Samsunear, Ali, if I may, from BAWSO. She's Head of National Services at BAWSO. And what I wanted to ask you, first of all, Sam, is what have been the biggest challenges for BAWSO over the course of the lockdown? And has anything started to change as we begin to transition out of lockdown?
Hi, thank you, Catherine. If I can start by putting BAWSO into context, just in case some of the members are not aware of what BAWSO does. So BAWSO is an all Wales organisation that supports victims of domestic abuse, forced marriage, FGM, and modern slavery and human trafficking. And we are the leading organisation that's been running these services for the past 25 years across Wales. So in terms of our support for victim, the normal process is that we do provide a 24-hour service for victims of domestic abuse. So we do provide refuge accommodation across Wales. So housing is a very important factor for our women to give them that safe space when they are going through their traumatic experience. And following, obviously, the practical and the emotional support that we do provide, the ultimate phase is to rehouse them. And for those victims who are eligible for benefits, the natural process is that they would get into social housing and be rehoused, and then we would provide resettlement support for them to settle in the community. Now, with BAWSO being the specialist organisation, one of the additional sort of group that we do support are those under immigration control, women with no recourse to public funds. Now, for them, because they have no secure immigration status, and if there's no support for them, naturally they can't access housing. So they are always put in that vulnerable position. Now, from going back 15 years, I mean, we've had the provision from the Home Office for the DDV concession. So through that provision, we've supported many more women than we naturally would have, where we are fighting their immigration case to show that they are fleeing because of domestic abuse, and they do get their status for their leave to remain, and then they can access benefits as well. And as a result, over the years, it seems that, you know, we are supporting more than 50% of our women are through that status. So we seem to be, I suppose, attracting a particular group of women. Now, what's happened during the pandemic, the added issues have been the fact that services have been closed, processes for housing benefit for those victims have been slower. Again, if we've had cases of the pandemic breakdown, then we're quarantining the refugees, so we can't move them on. We can't risk women coming in from the outside. So there's been lockdown situations as well. But even if, you know, that wasn't happening, the housing seemed to be very slow at the moment, the move on. So we are technically bed blocking. And we've had, you know, loads of referrals. So as lockdowns are easing, we've seen spikes of people trying to seek refuge provisions or advice and support. But what's happening is because we can't move the women who are in the refuges already, that's causing a blockage. And then, you know, you're just in limbo. Do you tell them to stay home? Are they safe? Do you tell them to stay with friends until there's a space available? And I mean, we've had a bit of flexibility, the fact that we've got several refuges, we can move women around, but then there hasn't been enough. And also, I know the Welsh Government had the scheme where they said they'll have empty hotel rooms and bed and breakfasts available as well. But then they have been filled up mainly by general homelessness victims, but not domestic abuse because of the risk factor. The support wouldn't be there in place. They'll be mixing with the general public and it wouldn't be secure as well. And just one of the other area that, you know, we need to sort of consider is that when somebody's under, you know, are seeking asylum, they're put into NAS accommodation, and they aren't always the most conducive environment for, you know, BME women, vulnerable women. And you know, I've seen one of the provisions itself where women are together, they're expected to have showers, you know, share shower facilities and so on. And, you know, the women are already vulnerable, they're fearful, and they're looking even more scared. So their trauma hasn't quite gone away. So again, it's women, like we said, are generally vulnerable. And like Alicja said, that, you know, they are the ones who need a home, they're the ones with children, but with the added addition of, you know, violence and the trauma that they've gone through, it's really traumatizing for them not to have a roof over your head, and that's a basic need for someone. So I think this issue really does need to get looked at.
Thank you, Samsunear. That's a really good explanation of what women have been going through during the pandemic, especially in terms of violence against women. And I think we'll definitely come back to you to talk about what are those lessons that we can learn for next time and what are the solutions. But I'm going to go now to Ruth. So Ruth Power, as she already said, is CEO of Shelter Cymru, quite new to the role. Her background is in the voluntary sector and in justice, which I'm sure is very helpful for this. So Ruth, the question I really want to ask you is, can you explain why housing is a feminist issue?
Yeah, absolutely. And Samsunear has helpfully touched on some of the issues there, actually. I think really powerfully, actually, from direct experience as well of working with people. So I suppose the first thing to say is that one of the challenges is that the public discourse on homelessness, it can be dominated by talk of rough sleeping, and rough sleeping is predominantly male. So when people have an image in their mind of who's homeless, they often think of a male rough sleeper. And that's particularly unhelpful, really, in terms of thinking about women's homelessness, because it's misleading and it underplays the extent to which homelessness and housing need really is an issue for women. There are a variety of sort of relevant factors, really, I suppose, in considering that. The gender income gap, as has been referred to, really is a really significant factor. And you can't think about housing without thinking about how people afford their housing, as others have touched upon. Women's caring responsibilities as well frame their experience of homelessness. And as Samsunear just touched upon, really, abuse, sexual exploitation, domestic violence are all really relevant factors. So in terms of the impact of the gender pay gap, one of the things that the United Nations sort of set out as an expectation really was that in thinking about housing affordability for women, that countries should think about strategies that take account of women's economic conditions, take account of women's status as a result of the gender pay gap. And it's really clear that, you know, we've not heeded that advice. So, for example, the gender pay gap means that for women on a median income, they need about the cost of owner occupation really requires them to borrow about 15 times their salary compared to 10 times for men. In terms of women in the private rented sector, women in the private rented sector spend 55% of their income on housing, which is a phenomenal amount. But that's just under 20% less for men. So there's a huge disparity actually in the proportion of women's income that goes towards housing costs compared to men. And then unsurprisingly, when you look at housing benefit, 60% of people claiming housing benefit as adults are females. So again, women are sort of overrepresented there as people needing support in order to afford their accommodation. And what that means is that things like the bedroom tax then have a disproportionate impact on women because they are heavily dependent on housing benefit. So the gender income gap is a really significant issue. There's then something about women's experience of homelessness, what it looks and feels like to be a woman that's homeless. And as has been touched upon, it's that hidden homelessness is more of an issue for women. The fear of safety on the streets and in mixed hostels, as Samsunear touched upon, absolutely. In bed and breakfast, temporary accommodation, any kind of shared accommodation. During the pandemic, we saw floor space being used, and I was really surprised coming into post to find that floor space, so somewhere literally to sleep for the night and to walk around all day until you could sleep there again. I was really surprised to find that floor space was being provided that was mixed gender. And certainly Shelter Cymru has worked with women who have preferred to sleep in outdoors as compared to sleeping indoors in a mixed gender setting. The issues of safety and women's economic position really are kind of predominate, I think, as you think about women's experiences of homelessness. Single parents are overwhelmingly female, so that again shapes women's experience of homelessness. We know single parents have lower incomes, but single parents, when you compare them to two-parent households, also are less likely to have a secure or safe home. So again, that's another compounding factor. So when we look at who's statutorily homeless, disproportionately that is women, and disproportionately that is single mothers. So they're overrepresented in those statistics. So as I say, that public discourse about who's homeless and that mental picture people have of homelessness is really odds with the way that women experience homelessness. We need to think more broadly about homelessness. And then, in terms of sexual exploitation and domestic violence, as I say, Samsunear will talk eloquently about that. I just wanted to say a little bit about sort of safety issues and for women in housing. So we work with women who have been assaulted within their shared accommodation, be that in terms of violence or in terms of sexual assault. We work with women who've been subject to multiple sexual assaults in shared accommodation. So there are real safety issues that we see and experience within our casework that are affecting women in shared accommodation settings, from where that assault is happening from people outside of their household. We also see women who have been offered money off their rent in exchange for sex. That is a feature of our casework. In our survey in 2017, we did a YouGov survey of over 300 private renters, and we found then that 3% of women had been asked for sex for rent at some point. There are still publicly posted ads for accommodation, which more or less explicitly offer accommodation in return for sex. And that puts women who are in desperate need for accommodation in a really vulnerable position. And that's all of that experience is consistent really with an earlier study. And I was interested in an earlier study in England, actually, where they interviewed 400 plus women, and they found of those women, a shocking 20% of women had engaged in sex work to pay for her hotel for the night, compared to just 3% of men. 28% of women had spent the night with someone specifically to gain access to accommodation, compared to just 14% of men. And 19% of women had engaged in sex work to enable them to spend a night with a client, compared to 3% of men. So there are some really shocking figures that really demonstrate that homelessness looks and feels different for women, you know, because we know again that women who are homeless have a disproportionate experience of abuse and trauma before they come into homelessness. It's even more shocking then to see that they have that disproportionate experience of abuse and trauma whilst they are homeless. So it can be a very damaging experience for women, and is far beyond a housing issue.
Okay, Ruth, thank you. That's really sobering to hear those figures and statistics. And I'm hoping that then Alicja can take us through how you think that the Back the Bill campaign can help deal with the issues that you've all pointed out. So if you can tell us what the Back the Bill campaign is and how it will help us, well, help women to avoid homelessness, domestic violence and sex for rent.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So Back the Bill campaign is a joint campaign between run by Pawb, Shelter Cymru and Chartered Institute of Housing Cymru. However, we are looking to kind of widen the coalition of organisations that will work actively with us to call for the right to housing. And it is what it says it is. We basically drafted a bill that would enshrine right to housing into Welsh law. We're asking for people to support it. You can do that on all our websites, and we're asking the government to enshrine it into Welsh law. So currently, adequate housing is a human right, which is part of what we call UN Covenant on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights. UK as a whole has subscribed to this, but it hasn't been really enacted in our domestic law, which basically means you can't properly kind of introduce it as a right in the UK and in Wales. And there are no protections. Scotland, as we speak, is looking to enshrine all socioeconomic rights, the whole covenant, including right to housing, into their law. And what it does is it basically says it's housing, a home, is a fundamental human need and right. It requires governments and authorities as well to make a very clear rights-based plan on how they will progressively realize that right for everyone. And it needs to be, you know, smart, that plan, and use the maximum available resources for that. It requires policymakers across all areas. So think, you know, planning, children's policy, budgets, anything you can imagine really, to think very carefully about the impact that their decisions would have on people's right to housing before they are made. It enables greater public scrutiny and transparency through Senate, through political institutions and public debate as well. And ultimately, it enables people to challenge decisions which breach their right to adequate housing in court. So something that would be, we think, would be a game changer, really, in how we treat housing, how we see housing, and it would offer us stronger protections. Because, like, if you think about it, there are sort of five. How I think about it, there are 5 fundamental values that we as a society kind of value and have enshrined rights in legislation to protect those. You know, these are right to food, we all need to eat, healthcare, education, and work, and housing. But housing is missing from that, from legislation and from being seen as a right, really. But if you don't have a home, you won't eat properly, your health is hugely affected, you'll struggle to access education. And just from what Ruth and Sam said, you can see how that affects women as well.
And Alicja, so did you manage to get that into any of the manifestos before the election? And are you working to now get that into the programme for government?
Yes, absolutely. So we managed to get it into 3 political party manifestos, which was, it was great to see. And we also, it didn't go into the current government's, the party manifesto. However, we've held many conversations with the then and now Minister for Housing. It was subject to debates in the Senate and at various events as well. And we have a stated commitment from the Housing Minister to make that right a reality, at least by the end of the Assembly term. However, it didn't go into the manifesto, so it's somewhat tentative, and therefore we're asking for people's support to consider, but also keen to discuss how it could kind of make your lives better, how it could be introduced so that it's beneficial for women.
Great. Yeah, so I know Meg has very helpfully put the Back the Bill link in the chat, so please do sign up and support both that and the Fight for Home that Shelter have put on there too, because of course if we all add our voices, these changes are more likely to happen. So coming back to Sam now, I wanted to ask you about what policy change you think is needed in the housing sphere that will really support women facing domestic violence, and also to try and combat the sex for rent that Ruth talked about earlier.
I think hearing about the figures, what Ruth has expressed about sex for rent, I mean, that's really concerning, because I think that's one of the reasons why women are reluctant to move into private accommodation, because there's not that security or some kind of vetting at the moment. And apart from the long-term side of it as well, because when women move after the traumatic situation, they do want to move where it's somewhere long-term and not having to keep on moving on short tenancy. And it's not really nice for the children and the young people who want to be going to the same school, settle with the same friend network. So we have to make those choices very carefully for women as well. And the fact that at the moment where women are fleeing, we have to make sure that it's nowhere near the perpetrators as well. So choosing where they rehouse is really important, and we do take those things into consideration versus how good is our housing application to the local authority as well. So I think we have to look at a different model and a framework, really, because if we are saying housing is human rights, and at the moment it's a bit of a lottery and depends on availability, and knowing that the level of domestic abuse is escalating and there are more single families as a result, so that naturally there's going to be need for more housing. But how do you provide more suitable, sustainable housing? So maybe more schemes, and like they have the 30-50 schemes, or in social housing with support. I mean, I'm not an expert in the area, but I think we need to look at an alternative model, because at the moment we are really bed blocking, and there aren't always suitable accommodation, and especially with some BME women, although they want to get away from the perpetrators, but at the same time, they want a sense of community, some cultural activities nearby where they live as well. And sometimes they're thrown into sort of council estates with unfamiliar faces, and that again can result into isolations of where they are staying and living as well, and the added issues of, you know, racism they face, discrimination. So they have still have a lot to deal with when they are rehoused from our refuges as well. So we do definitely look at how people are housed, and for the women to have choice. I think that's really important as well.
Thank you for bringing that in. Yeah, absolutely. Choice is incredibly important. But what I wanted to understand as well is if this kind of bed blocking, as you call it, is going on, is there a need for more? It sounds so obvious, but is there a need for more refuge spaces? And is that what you mean? We need a new model. We need a new model also in terms of providing refuge spaces, and we need more money so that there are more spaces, because there are no spaces available at the moment by the sounds of it.
There aren't. I mean, obviously, you know, when BAWSO set up, I mean, we had our first refuge in Cardiff, for example, and I think this was in 1995, so going back about 25 years. And it took us many years after that. Back in 2003, I think we developed our other two refuges in Southeast and Southwest without disclosing specific locations. And more recently, in 2010, we applied for actually refuges in North Wales with no success. So at the end, we had to apply a different model where we actually rent an accommodation from a housing association, and we call it a dispersed refuge because it's literally a unit for one family, because it's not a HMO. And we are, you know, you can imagine a large community in North Wales, yet we only have one unit of accommodation for victims of domestic abuse in North Wales. And we've tried working with local authorities with no success. So definitely, we haven't, you know, had an increase in our accommodation. So, and the demands have been going up. But at the same time, I think we need to, again, sometimes when we classify BME community and look at the issues, we just think it's just one bag of issues. But at the same time, when we're looking at emerging needs and gaps in our services, we find that, for example, for victims of domestic abuse, victims of forced marriage, they tend to be younger pupils who are fleeing before their parents are trying to marry them off. So if they're, we've had victims like that, where they may not have never made their own breakfast, made their own bed, and they're coming to an accommodation where they're expected to do so, and they found it really hard to cope. So again, we had to look at alternative where they had support, additional support in place as well. So I see that as a huge gap. Or there are other cases where traditionally with domestic abuse, you're fleeing from your partner, but in forced marriage cases, you're fleeing from your parents, and you might want to protect, you might have a boyfriend, you want to be running away with him because he's just as risk from the community as the girl. So they want to move away together. So we haven't got any kind of, you know, secure accommodation for both individuals who are fleeing together from the parents. So I don't think, you know, those things have been considered anywhere really. And I mean, recently we had the UK Forced Marriage Commission come to Wales, and they held a roundtable discussion with specialist organisations and the statutory sector, which BAWSO co-hosted with him. And that's one of the things that came through, is that, you know, is there a lack of housing, and what, you know, especially with the housing bill going through, you know, what do we need to do to change that? So I think we need to look at, you know, specific you know, refuges. I mean, at the moment, we've got refuges for victims of human trafficking, and we have to have added security measures that's different to victims of domestic abuse, because they are fleeing from ringleaders, and you know, they've got a larger network that we have to keep them secure from, and then the police are heavily involved in those more than a victim of domestic abuse. So I think we need to look at each category of our victims and profile them and look at what their needs are. I mean, again, when we were supporting victims of domestic abuse and asylum seekers, for example, if they're fleeing from war-torn countries, they've had their own other forms of trauma, as well as fleeing through the whole journey as well. And there's added issues around that, and persecution, political persecution. So we can get political leaders chasing them off abroad, and you know, also. So, you know, we are looking at high-risk victims here as well. So we need to look at their individual needs. And I suppose when we say, you know, the Equality Act, and we try to treat everyone equally, and you know, that's not the case. I think you have to treat everyone individually according to their needs, because it's very different and diverse.
Thank you. That's a really good explanation of all the different areas of need there are, and how complex it is, and that we need, you know, local authorities it's not just government we need to look to and service providers, but it's also all those people in between. So yeah, very complex picture. So we've got some questions from the floor now. One question from Jennifer is, what can older feminists, for example, who founded Women's Aid or Coastal Housing Association and now Swansea Co-Housing do? So Ruth, what could, I'm going to ask you that, what could people do to support? I think we know about the bill and your
yeah, absolutely. You know, we would really encourage you to add your voices in terms of backing the bill. Would really encourage you to join Shelter Cymru's fight for home. So this is, you know, relating to our findings around over 1 million people in Wales being affected by the housing emergency. You know, we're in a situation where we're dealing with this legacy of underinvestment in housing. We've got rising housing costs, you know, which are outstripping people's incomes. And I was kind of reflecting, we've got a, you know, there is an interesting programme for Welsh Government which is guided by the work of the Homelessness Action Group. And, you know, a question that we might be asking at this point is, you know, to what extent do the recommendations of the Homelessness Action Group and the approach to implementation of them take account of the gendered experience of homelessness? So I think that was is a question that could very reasonably be posed actually by yourselves, and would be a useful challenge actually at a really formative stage in Welsh Government, taking forward a really welcome and ambitious agenda. How agenda that agenda is, I think, is a very different question. So, you know, raising challenging questions like that, I think, you know, in terms of scrutinising the plans that are in hand and holding to account and adding your voices and experience really of, you know, what a gendered experience of violence is. There's some really interesting work going on within Welsh Government around the Race Equality Action Plan, you know, and arguably there's a similar need to kind of, you know, raise voices in terms of women's experience actually, and in this case, particularly in the case of housing and how we take forward those homelessness action plans. I think listening to sort of Samsunear speaking, one of the things that was in my mind really is, you know, I suppose there's a question about how you see some of these issues around sexual exploitation and violence, how you see them through the lens of housing and homelessness, and I'm not sure we're very good at looking at those issues through that lens. So it would be reasonable to ask the question whether our housing system is an enabler of sexual exploitation and domestic violence, or does it really actively sort of minimise the risks of women being exploited and subject to abuse? I think there are some really challenging questions that people like yourselves could raise actually around how the system works and to hold that system to account, viewing it through a gendered lens.
Okay,
could I just say, Catherine, we would welcome, we're actually looking at land in Swansea, we're actually looking at building. We actually, because I've been involved in the co-housing women's group in London, and as a feminist, and obviously Jane Hutt's generation, I'd really welcome somebody coming on to our committee, because we're trying to be strategic, and thank you for those comments. But we're actually, yesterday I plodded around no end of sites, and I would really welcome somebody joining us.
Okay, look, but Jennifer, do get in touch with me after this. Send us, put your details on here, and we can certainly send around the opportunity to be on your board or anything else to the people at the cafe and to our WEN members. So no problem. Thank you for that. So the next question, I've just got slightly lost. So Ellie says the proportion of women's income that gets eaten up by housing costs is a major factor in the terrible poverty for children in lone parent households. And a question from Megan. We know that a lack of accessible housing is a problem for disabled people generally, but have you seen a gender dimension to this or a particular problem for disabled women? Who would like to answer that one? Alicia?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So we've recently, last year, we carried out this very comprehensive research in partnership with Disability Wales and others in Gwent, looking at accessible housing across all the 5 different local authority areas. And part of that was speaking to disabled people, doing surveys and so on, many of them women. You know, what struck me in that is that we've got a huge shortage of accessible housing, especially wheelchair accessible housing. It means that people either have to wait for years for accommodation, if they are on a social housing list. It's extremely difficult to get private rented, adapted or accessible accommodation. Not everyone can afford to own. Or it means that they accept unsuitable homes. And, within the allocation systems that we looked at, there was quite a few stories from younger women with, usually with children, around kind of having to accept being so desperate for accommodation which is accessible and which basically meets your requirements, and having to accept accommodation which sometimes is not entirely suitable, but also is in a very different area, to where you are, because there's very far and few between houses which are both accessible and available for families as well. So I remember speaking to one woman talking about how they had to move out of the catchment area, very far away from school. She's a wheelchair user, takes her longer in the morning to get everything ready anyway, the whole family. But now she's gotten, an added time and transport, and that's not accessible either. So, that there is a dimension there. And in homelessness as well, I think we don't have figures on that actually, but anecdotally speaking to some of the big homelessness charities like the Wallet, for example, we know that some of them are seeing more kind of disabled people now. Sometimes that's linked to substance misuse and mental health issues, but more often we're seeing people who are, either wheelchair users or have other accessible needs, and whether our homeless kind of supported accommodation meets those needs. Quite a lot of it is quite old, not adapted as well. I think there is a dimension there. I'm not sure about kind of the gender dimension of that. I think Disability Wales looked at that previously with one of the homelessness organisations.
Yeah, Megan is from Disability Wales actually, and I'm sure she'll know if there's work going on in that area, but it definitely sounds like more needs to be done around this whole area of disaggregating statistics, because we need to know the extent of the problem before we can solve it, I think, and if we don't measure it, we don't know. Sam, I've got a question here around a question and comment which you may like to comment on, which is around repossession due to domestic abuse, which women suffer, and how that can be combated.
Well, from our experience, majority of the women who are fleeing from their home, I mean, the tenancy or, the ownership of the houses tend to be in their partners' names. And I mean, there may have been cases where, there's been joint roles, but I haven't got that information at hand at the moment, but I don't think they've, we've come across a situation where they've been sole owners or anything. It's been mainly the partners, but obviously because they're fleeing, our main role is to protect them, then support them. And I mean, I'm just trying to think top of my head. I think there was a case where I think we were asked the question is what happens to half of her housing if she's no longer, but I think that becomes part of the matrimonial case that we deal with the separation, divorce, and obviously what they are legally entitled to, and our solicitors would deal with that. But I'm not sure. I mean, I'd have to come back to you if there wasn't a repossession issue in particular with regards to our client group.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here from Ron. Does the bill propose alterations to the Housing Acts, particularly the pieces that refer to homelessness, priority, need definitions, and right to be given reasonable preference, or is it a separate piece of legislation like the Human Rights Act? So I think that's probably one for Alicja on the
it's a separate piece of legislation, a bit like the Human Rights Act, and it's something that we can do here now in Wales. We've done it with children's rights. So it wouldn't amend anything straight away, but what it would do is it would give us powers to challenge policies and legislation which is basically incompatible with human rights. So similarly to how Human Rights Act has led to many, many changes in legislation and laws that we have here, some of them affecting women to a great extent. In a similar vein, having, a human rights bill on housing or right to housing bill or act would mean that some of the provisions that we now have in legislation would probably be deemed incompatible with that, and we could challenge that. So our research, our feasibility study on the right to housing from 2 years ago, which is on our websites, by the way, illustrates that there's some case studies there how and why it could be done. For example, on intentional homelessness, it shows how that's breaching right to housing and how we could challenge that. Yeah.
Would anyone else like to comment on that? No, no worries if not. Well, did someone put their hand up? Sorry. No. I wanted to ask, as we kind of draw to a close, please do pop any more questions in the chat if you have them, but in the absence of more questions, I think what would really be helpful from each of the panelists as we round up is if you had a magic wand, notwithstanding everything you've already mentioned, but if you had a magic wand and you were First Minister, what is it you would want to do to solve this problem around adequate housing for women, obviously within your specific work area? I'd really like to hear that. And I'd like to start with you, Ruth, if that's okay, putting you on the spot. But yeah, come and tell what you think really needs to happen.
Yeah. It's a good time to ask the question. As I say, the government's made a commitment to build back better and fairer. And I think, that and fairer is something we've been exploring really in this conversation, isn't it? And we're urging Welsh Government to put housing and the housing emergency at the heart of that thinking about building back better and fairer. In terms of what the change I'd like to see, I suppose it's just a shift in the system away from the current system, which is very geared up towards gatekeeping, and a shift towards a system which is about enabling people to have access to good housing. We all need good housing, as Alicja set out. It's the foundation of our lives. So it's moving to a system of enabling and moving on from a system which delivers good financial returns for some people, our housing system, but it fails to deliver good homes for all. And just really having that fundamental shift in our mindset about the role that housing plays in our society.
Great, thank you, Ruth. So nothing less than a massive culture change, really, because
Indeed.
Obviously, yeah, that's a challenge. But yeah, we should all take that on and encourage the new programme for government to cover that kind of thing. So Sam, what about you? If you were First Minister and could wave a magic wand, what would you do to solve this problem?
I think stock of new suitable housing, but affordable housing as well. So some kind of scheme to sort of have, I don't know, cheaper housing for women. And also, and I think, I'm a believer of prevention work as well, because I think we are trying to obviously cure a situation because of the abuse that's happening, but I think more investment has to be done in prevention. And I know we're in particular cases of FGM and forced marriage, these two offences have been criminalised, and there hasn't been much cases gone to court purely because these are against parents and families, and puts the young people at a very awkward situation of feeling isolated and being abandoned by the family, and the implication it has on their own family in the long term. So and I think a lot of for statutory services, I mean, they automatically are calling the parents perpetrators, but if you take a step back and think these are long-standing cultural practices where parents think it's the norm. So I think it's about education, raising awareness, and still challenging those practices to prevent a lot of these issues happening. And because of those issues, obviously people get into relationships, and then the escalation of domestic abuse as well. So it does intertwine sometimes. So I'm just thinking about overall reduction of violence against women, which could lead to the need. That would be the ultimate aid for me if that was the other way around. But apart from that, I think suitable housing is the way forward.
Thank you, Samsunear. And finally coming to you, Alicja, for the kind of final word. What do you think is the one thing that could be done to resolve the housing crisis?
Yes, I think we need about 1,000 things, Catherine. So it's a really difficult question. But, you know, I would say that a fundamental shift backed by legislation and how we view, see, and invest in housing. You know, if you think about our parents, people from a generation or two ago, housing was much more affordable, and somehow through the years it's become this kind of expensive, often seen as a commodity thing, and we've somehow all accepted it in a way. So we need to understand it very differently, and it can't be, you know, the poor cousin of healthcare, of education, of social care, because it's fundamental to those things. So we need investment, and we need to recognize it for what it is. CIH Cymru have recently done a YouGov poll, and it says that 77% of people in Wales would like to see housing as a human right. I think we're all beginning to understand the importance of it.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I think what's clear to me is a few things. Just to round up before we close, it seems to me that very like every situation we face in terms of policy change, in order to make Wales fairer and more equal, and for us in terms of our vision to have a Wales free from gender discrimination, there isn't just one solution. It's a solution around, you know, the legal framework, the educational framework, the social and cultural framework. And I think, and also, of course, it's hugely impacted, women are hugely impacted by violence against women, which is a pandemic in itself. And if it was treated in that way, I think we could have a much better chance of stamping that out as well. So I think as well, it's all tied up, isn't it, with poverty and fairness and women being in poverty. There was something that we haven't discussed here, but I feel like I wonder whether this will help when the UBI pilot that's going to be done, how will that impact? Has that got potential to support better housing for women? I don't know, but it feels like we need action on lots and lots of levels. And I really hope this When Cafe has opened the conversation to some of our members, and also it's certainly given us food for thought at When in terms of what we should be calling for and pushing the new programme for government towards, certainly around this disaggregation of data. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. A huge thank you to Ruth Power, to Alicja, and to Samsunear for all your help and interest. And you can see there's some great positive comments on the chat for you all. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of you who've come to the cafe as well. We'll be sending out after this a link so you can listen to it again if you want to, and we'll certainly push forward the asks in here to Welsh Government and in appropriate places. So thank you very much, everyone.